A legally imposed minimum wage, a racist, fascist, and downright anti-poor policy that has been sold to the plebs to be the exact opposite of what it is. Let's explore. Hello everyone, and welcome to another installment of Freedom Alternative Research and Analysis. Now, around 10 months ago, I made a video called Fascism is Progressive, in which I compared Benito Mussolini's fascist manifesto with the policies of the modern left. The establishment of a legally binding minimum wage was, and continues to be to this very day, a fundamental tenet of fascist governance. So the idea that a minimum wage is not a fascist policy is not only laughable, but completely ignorant. Now, before going into why minimum wage laws are fundamentally bad, one needs to first understand the exact reasons for which the fascists in Italy, the KKK-endorsed Democrats in the United States, the Boers in the apartheid South Africa, and other totalitarians wanted minimum wage laws to begin with. Basically, a wage is a price. Just like the price for bread, or the price for a haircut, or the price for a souvenir. And the mechanism that forms that price is identical in all cases, namely at the intersection of supply and demand plus the result of bargaining. So let's take every case and review it a little bit. In Benito Mussolini's time, society was supposed to be rearranged on the newly formed fascist model. The parliament was effectively transformed into what was called at the time the Chamber of Corporations. And since the Chamber of Corporations was effectively handpicked by the Fascist Council starting in 1929, the fascists could demand whatever they pleased in order to allow various corporations into the chamber. And one of the things they did demand was a minimum wage. Now, in return to establishing a minimum wage, the corporations would get a seat in the Chamber of Corporations and get special favors from the state. Later on, this policy was also used to drive out Jewish businesses from the market after initially driving out from the market every small business without the clout necessary to get itself into the corridors of power in the Chamber of Corporations. Millions of people lost their jobs and/or their small businesses that kept them afloat, but that wasn't exactly a problem for the regime, especially as those losing were the right kind of people. Moreover, some local fascist politicians even used this to then drive those losing out into working for the large corporations that were part of the Chamber of Corporations, and then argue that the fascist policy of the minimum wage prevented the losers' decay into starvation. Now, how familiar does that sound? In plain language, if you would make $100 a day, let's say for instance with your business from which you paid your employee to $25 a day and another $40 other expenses, you'd make $35 in gross profit. But then the fascist state comes in and says you must pay $30 a day, and international instability drives your company's income to $90 a day. Basically, it gets cheaper to close shop than to continue. And then the politician offers you a low-level position into a big faceless corporation for $30 a day, and calls that a good thing. Basically, that was minimum wage in fascist Italy. Now let's get to the United States. Now, I think I've said this story in the past as well, but anyway. Basically, the first minimum wage law of the United States was the Davis-Bacon Act of 1931, which was a federal law that established the requirement for paying the local, quote, prevailing wage on public works projects for laborers and mechanics. Why did the congressmen of the time think this was a much-needed bill? Well, John Cochran, KKK-endorsed Democrat from Missouri, explained at the time that he had received, quote, numerous complaints in recent months about Southern contractors employing low-paid colored mechanics getting work and bringing the employees from the South, close quote. His concerns were further echoed by another KKK-endorsed Democrat, Mr. Clayton Allgood, who complained about, quote, cheap-collared labor that is in competition with white labor throughout the country. Now, at that time, construction trades was a heavily unionized profession, so the phrasing prevailing wage de facto meant the union wage. And since this is the 1930s United States, it should come as no surprise that the craft unions did not admit black apprentices, and therefore black laborers had no way of becoming union members to begin with. In other words, the minimum wage was a very effective way of taking away the bargaining chip that black workers had at their disposal to find work, namely their ability to negotiate directly. Now, aren't unions great? Now, the same thing happened in apartheid South Africa, where white unions advocated for minimum wage regulations as a response to the fact that employers, both white and black, preferred to employ whomever worked at the most effective or efficient cost. And since blacks were the majority in South Africa, it should come as no surprise that most of the time employers did prefer to hire blacks who did tend to work for less than whites. This was particularly prevalent in the construction industry, where at the time there was also a lot of need for physical force. The employers were approaching the problem in a very capitalist fashion. Why hire highly trained 100 Europeans for menial tasks like moving the cement from point A to point B when I only need 5 highly trained workers on this site and the rest of 95 can be less trained and lower skilled? So they would only hire 5 highly trained workers, most of them white, and 95 lower skilled workers that were paid less, and most of them black. This trade-off was a very good deal. It allowed the employer to optimize the costs and allowed otherwise disenfranchised black to get a hold on the first rung of the ladder and a chance to become skilled workers themselves, which many of them did, by the way, did become skilled workers until the minimum wage laws stopped this process of lifting blacks from unskilled labor force to skilled labor force. Now, I do suggest you read the book South Africa's War Against Capitalism by Dr. Walter E. Williams. It's a very good book and goes into the minutiae of the racist-inspired anti-capitalist policies during the apartheid era. Chapters 3 and 4 of the book deal at length with market manipulation, labor laws, and all of the rest. Now, you'll find that most of what you'll read there is currently in place right now in most of progressive Europe, and just like progressive Europe, apartheid South Africa soon become a place of stagnation and slow but definitive economic degeneration. Now, with all that being said, let's look a little bit into other reasons and other insidious effects of minimum wage laws that are rarely discussed. I mean, it's already a no-brainer that it affects the least qualified workers, and if it's set high enough in conjunction with the welfare state, it effectively makes it less profitable to work than to stay on the dole for certain people. It's also been, widely discussed how minimum wage hikes lead to job losses and so on and so forth, so I won't get into that. There's plenty of videos on YouTube addressing that part of the problem. Instead, let's approach the issue unconventionally, in layman's terms. So let's look at areas where there is no minimum wage, such as the internet. Now imagine what effect it would have if no content creator would be allowed to operate and make an income on YouTube if his or her income would be less than, let's say, 1,000 euros a month, which is the minimum wage in Austria right now. Suddenly, when the problem is phrased in this fashion, the inherent flaws of the minimum wage policies become self-evident, don't they? I mean, how can a content creator even get to the state of making 1K a month if it's illegal to start at 0 euros a month? Who would benefit from such a policy? Well, certainly not the content creators who make less than that. Such a policy would only benefit those who are already established because they'd see a certain amount of their competition suddenly go away. Same things it happens in any other sector, be it construction work, factory work, call center services, you name it. But then there's the other claim, namely that if there would be no minimum wage, widespread underemployment would arise. But is that even true? Switzerland doesn't have a minimum wage, neither does Norway, nor Sweden, nor Italy. One can hardly make a case that these nations are rife with sweatshops and slave labor. Moreover, there are countries in which the legal minimum wage is de facto abolished since it's set way below the market rate. Such example is Sri Lanka, where the minimum legal wage is 6,500 rupees per month, which is about 45 US dollars. Yet we reported a few days ago that even unregulated sweatshop laborers make a lot more than that. Which goes to show, once again, that wage increases don't come from the government. And quite frankly, they never did. Another insidious effect of the minimum wage laws is the driving down to zero of the payment for apprentices of any kind, really. Now, certain white-collar professions have found workarounds, such as internships, but as young people can notice these days, most internships are unpaid. And the reason for that is not necessarily corporate greed, but the minimum wage laws. There are far more paid internships in countries with flexible employment legislation, such as Germany, Ukraine, Serbia, Czech Republic, Sweden, than there are in comparison with countries with, less flexible wage laws, such as France, or Canada, or Spain. This again is not an accident. If you're a young coder aspiring for a career in a big company in Austria, there's a very slim chance that you can produce the amount of value that is worth your salary. Because let's not forget that in progressive Europe, 1,000 euros a month means that your employer actually pays almost 2,000 euros every month, so that you can get a net salary of 800, thanks to the legal fiction of the so-called employer's contribution, which in reality is also part of your gross wage. As a result, the only legal way to help a youngster starting in life is to get him or her under an unpaid internship in which he or she is provided with non-monetary perks, such as a vacation or extra access to the company's services or whatever. Those who have worked in these environments will already know full well how much of a legal pain in the ass is to get an intern. Ultimately, a minimum wage law is the state imposing a cost on a service just because it can. Everyone would object if the state were to pass a law that says the internet bill should be at least $1,000 a month, because everyone would understand that the state has no business in establishing how much a provider ought to charge for the service. But somehow, a significant chunk of the populace is still struggling with applying the exact same concept to all forms of services, including labor. The argument that labor is somehow special and different than other services, such as internet providing, simply does not hold water. Paying the internet bill still leads to paying actual people who set up and maintain the infrastructure. It's still labor, yet it's self-evident why the state shouldn't directly decide how much that service should cost, but it's somehow okay for the state to indirectly decide by putting in artificial barriers and jacking up the costs. Really, the supporters of this fascist policy need to do some introspection work on themselves, because this is not just an intellectual issue. This prevailing societal cognitive dissonance is harming actual people by the millions. And it's harming particularly our youth and the least skilled members of our societies. Thank goodness there were no child labor laws, and thank goodness inflation had effectively abolished the minimum wage laws when I started dealing newspapers on the streets when I was 12. Otherwise, I would have acquired the basic skills of taking responsibility for my work a lot later in life. And that would have been a tragedy. Anyway, with all of that being said, thank you for watching, and thank you for your continuous support of this channel. I'll see you around on Freedom Alternative.